don't remember exactly when I first heard about the village. What I remember is the feeling that followed, the quiet sense that this was something I already knew, something I had simply forgotten for a while. Some places enter our lives loudly. They announce themselves with signs, maps, directions, and explanations. Others arrive quietly, without asking permission, appearing only when we are tired enough, distracted enough, or lonely enough not to question them. The road that led to the village was not marked. I had been driving for hours, long after the familiar towns had thinned into scattered lights and empty stretches of land. Night came slowly, the way it does when you are focused on staying awake rather than watching the sky. The radio faded into static, then silence. Even the dashboard clock seemed hesitant, its numbers glowing faintly, as if unsure whether time was still important. I should have turned back earlier. That much I knew. But fatigue has a way of narrowing the world. All decisions become smaller, simpler. Keep going. Don't stop. Just a little farther. The road curved gently, then more sharply, winding through low hills and dark trees. At some point, I realized there were no longer any reflective signs along the edges, no mile markers, no warning symbols. The headlights illuminated only what was directly ahead, and beyond that, everything dissolved into shadow. It was then that I noticed the silence, not the absence of sound, but a deeper quiet, the kind that feels intentional. No insects, no distant traffic, no wind brushing against the car. Even the engine seemed muted, as if the night itself were listening. I slowed down without meaning to. That was when I saw the first light. It appeared between the trees, warm and steady, unlike the cold glare of roadside lamps. Then another light, and another. Soon there were several, arranged not randomly, but with the gentle order of windows facing a street. I remember thinking how strange it was to see a village here, in a place that had felt so empty only moments before. There had been no sign announcing it, no indication that anyone lived nearby. Yet there it was, quietly existing, as if it had always been waiting just beyond the edge of awareness. The road straightened and led me forward, naturally, without choice. Houses came into view, modest, close together, their windows glowing with soft amber light. Smoke rose slowly from chimneys, drifting upward and dissolving into the night sky. The street was narrow but well kept, its surface smooth, untouched by cracks or debris. I expected to see people, someone walking, a door opening, a figure crossing the road. But there was no movement, only the lights, steady and calm, suggesting life without displaying it. I parked near what seemed to be the center of the village. The engine clicked softly as it cooled, the sound strangely loud in the stillness. For a moment, I remained in the car, hands resting on the steering wheel, unsure why a sense of hesitation had settled over me. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was the awareness that stepping out of the car would mean crossing some quiet boundary, one that did not announce itself with warnings. Eventually, I opened the door. Cool air touched my face, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and something else. Old paper, perhaps, or damp stone. The ground beneath my feet felt solid, reassuringly real. I listened. Still nothing. No footsteps from behind the houses, no voices, no distant laughter or conversation. And yet, the village did not feel abandoned. On the contrary, it felt occupied in a way I could not explain, as if its inhabitants were simply elsewhere, or perhaps waiting. I walked slowly down the street. The houses were different, but shared a common design, as though built from the same memory, rather than the same blueprint. Curtains hung in the windows, some drawn, some slightly open. In a few places, I thought I saw movement behind the glass, a shadow passing, a shift in light. But when I stopped to look more closely, everything was still again. What struck me most was the sense of recognition. I could not remember ever being there before, and yet nothing felt unfamiliar. The distance between the houses, the height of the doorways, even the way the light spilled onto the street, it all felt precisely arranged for someone like me. That was when I noticed something else. There were no clocks, not on the buildings, not in the windows, not on the street. Even the watch on my wrist seemed dimmer, its face reflecting the warm light, but refusing to show the time clearly. I lifted it closer, frowned, then lowered my arm again without understanding why it mattered. At the far end of the street, the road continued into darkness. Behind me, the way I had come was already difficult to see, the trees closing in gently, as though they had never truly opened. I remember standing there for a long moment, feeling neither lost nor found, suspended between the certainty of having arrived somewhere and the uncertainty of where I actually was. That was when the first door opened, not suddenly, not loudly, just enough for light to spill onto the street, warmer and brighter than before. Somewhere inside, something shifted. A chair, perhaps, or a footstep. And in that moment, I understood something without knowing how I knew it. The village did not appear to everyone, and it did not appear by accident. The door that had opened belonged to a small house near the center of the street. It was not the largest, nor the brightest, but something about it felt intentional, as though it had been chosen rather than discovered. A man stood in the doorway. He was neither young nor old, dressed simply, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he had been standing there for a long time. The light behind him framed his silhouette, softening the edges of his face. "You've arrived late," he said, not as an accusation, but as a simple observation. I hesitated before answering, uncertain why the word late unsettled me. I didn't realize anyone lived here, I replied. The man smiled faintly, as though he had heard that many times before. People live here, he said, just not always at the same time. He stepped aside, holding the door open without explicitly inviting me in. I understood, instinctively, that the choice was mine. Staying on the street felt equally strange, so I crossed the threshold. Inside, the house was warmer than expected. The air carried the scent of tea and something baked long ago. The room was modest: a wooden table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with books, whose spines were worn but carefully maintained. A small lamp cast a steady glow, free of flicker. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice lower than usual, as if the walls were listening. The man poured tea into 2 cups before answering. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. "This is a village," he said finally. "At night." "That's not an answer." He nodded. "It's the only one I have." We sat across from each other. The tea tasted familiar, though I could not have named its ingredients. With each sip, the fatigue I had carried for hours seemed to loosen its grip, not disappearing, but becoming lighter, more manageable. "You won't find this place during the day," the man continued. "Not because it isn't here, but because it isn't needed." "Needed by whom?" "By people who are still moving," he said, still certain of where they're going. I wanted to argue, to demand clarity, but something in his tone discouraged confrontation. Instead, I asked the question that had been forming since I stepped into the village. "Do people stay here?" "Some do," he replied. "For a night, for several nights, for longer." "And you?" He looked at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I stayed," he said simply. Outside the window, the village remained unchanged. Lights glowed steadily. Shadows rested where they had before. There was no indication that time had moved forward at all. The man followed my gaze. "It doesn't progress the way you expect," he said. "Here, night doesn't lead to morning. It leads inward." "Inward to what?" He smiled again, more gently this time. "To whatever you've been carrying without realizing it." I thought of the road, the long hours, the quiet pressure of expectations I hadn't questioned in years. I hadn't planned to stop anywhere. I had only wanted the night to end. "And what happens when morning comes?" I asked. The man lowered his cup. "For most people," he said, "morning comes somewhere else." I did not ask him to explain. I sensed that explanations were not the currency of this place. Stories were. "Others will wake soon," he added. "If you wish, you can meet them." "Others?" He gestured toward the window, toward the quiet houses and glowing lights. "Everyone here arrived for a reason," he said, "even if they don't know it yet." A subtle shift passed through the village then, not movement, but attention. as if doors that had been closed moments before were now aware of my presence. I realized I was no longer tired, and that realization unsettled me more than the silence ever had. After leaving the man's house, I returned to the street, though I could no longer tell how long I had been inside. The village looked the same, yet something had shifted. Not in the buildings or the lights, but in the way the space between them felt, as if it had grown more attentive, more aware of my presence. Other doors were open now, not wide, not inviting in any obvious way, but enough to suggest that the night had reached a certain moment, one where staying hidden was no longer necessary. I passed a house where a woman sat near the window, her hands folded in her lap. She did not look at me when I slowed my steps, but I sensed she knew I was there. Her face was calm, not sad, not content, simply settled, as if she had finished waiting for something and had accepted the result. Further down the street, an older couple stood near their doorway, speaking quietly to one another. Their words did not carry, but their gestures were familiar. The small, practiced movements of people who had shared silence for many years. When they noticed me, they nodded, not in greeting, but in recognition. I understood then that no one here was surprised by my arrival. Each person I saw seemed occupied not with the village itself, but with something inward. Some sat alone. Others moved slowly from room to room, touching objects, opening drawers, closing them again. It reminded me of the way people behave when they are packing, not to leave, but to decide what must be taken with them. I stopped near a house at the edge of the street. Its light was dimmer than the others, its windows partially obscured by curtains that had yellowed with age. From inside came the faint sound of pages turning. A man sat at a desk covered with papers. He looked up as I approached, his eyes sharp despite the fatigue etched into his face. "You won't find answers here," he said before I spoke. "I wasn't looking for answers," I replied, though the truth felt less certain the moment I said it. He gestured to the chair across from him. I sat. "I came here years ago," he said, arranging the papers into neat stacks. "I believed this place would explain something to me, why my life had unfolded the way it had, why certain choices felt inevitable." "And did it?" I asked. He considered the question. "It explained why I kept asking," he said. "Not why." Outside, the village remained unchanged. No footsteps echoed, no wind disturbed the air. The world beyond the houses felt distant, almost theoretical. "I thought staying longer would help," the man continued. "I thought if I waited, something would reveal itself. But this place doesn't reveal, it reflects." "What happens if you stay too long?" I asked. He smiled, not unkindly. "You stop needing the question," he said, "and for some people, that's enough." I left him there, surrounded by his careful order, and continued walking. As I moved deeper into the village, I noticed how similar the houses were inside, not in furniture or layout, but in intention. Each space seemed shaped around a single need: rest, reflection, reconciliation, forgetting. In one house, a young man stared into a mirror that did not show his reflection clearly. In another, a woman listened to music I could not hear, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and steady. Somewhere nearby, laughter drifted briefly through an open door, then faded. It occurred to me that the village did not assign roles. It did not judge. It did not guide anyone toward a specific outcome. It simply provided the conditions necessary for something internal to unfold. I wondered how many people had passed through here without realizing where they were. How many had stayed just long enough to feel lighter, clearer, more certain, and then returned to their lives carrying only a vague sense of having slept deeply. The idea unsettled me because I could already feel that sense settling in. The quiet loosening of urgency, the fading of sharp edges. The part of me that measured progress by distance and time felt less convincing here, less necessary. At the far end of the village, the street curved gently, disappearing into darkness. There were no lights beyond that point, no houses, just the suggestion of continuation. I stood there for a long moment, aware that I was being offered something without being told what it was. Behind me, the village waited. Ahead of me, the night extended, vast, undefined, untouched. For the first time since arriving, I understood that staying was not a passive act. It was a choice. I met him near the edge of the village, where the houses thinned and the light softened, as if the night itself were growing tired. His home stood slightly apart from the others, not isolated, but deliberate in its distance, like a pause placed carefully between sentences. He was sitting on the steps, looking outward toward the darkness where the village ended and nothing clearly began. He did not look surprised to see me. In fact, he smiled as though he had been expecting someone, though perhaps not me in particular. "You're still deciding," he said quietly. I sat beside him without asking permission. The wood beneath us was smooth, worn by time or touch. I couldn't tell which. "How long have you been here?" I asked. He thought for a moment, then shook his head gently. "I stopped measuring that," he said. "It made things harder." There was no bitterness in his voice, no regret, just a calm acceptance that felt unsettling in its completeness. "I arrived here during a winter much like this one," he continued. "I had been traveling with a purpose I no longer remember clearly. Something urgent, something that felt important at the time." He paused, as if listening inwardly. I remember the exhaustion more than the goal. The way everything I had been carrying began to feel heavier than it should have. When I found this place, I didn't think of it as a destination. I thought of it as a delay. "What made you stay?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the houses, their windows glowing softly, steady and patient. "At first, I told myself I would leave in the morning," he said. "Then I told myself I would leave once I understood what this place was. Later, I told myself I would leave once I felt ready." "And did you?" I asked. He smiled, faintly amused. "I realized one night that the question had changed," he said. "It was no longer, 'When will I leave?' but 'Why should I?' The village," he explained, "did not ask for commitment. It did not close its roads or lock its doors. Anyone could walk away at any time. That was what made staying meaningful. I stopped feeling like I was falling behind," he said. "Stopped feeling like life was something I had to chase. Here, nothing is waiting for you to catch up." I asked him whether he ever missed the world beyond the village. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not in the way people think. I miss the idea of it, the urgency, the noise, the belief that everything matters equally." He turned to me then, his gaze steady. "Out there," he said, "you are constantly reminded of who you are supposed to become. Here, you are allowed to exist without finishing that sentence." The words settled heavily between us. "What happens to people who stay too long?" I asked. He considered this carefully. "They become honest," he said at last. "Not with others, with themselves." A subtle chill passed through me at that. "I've seen people leave," he continued, "some after a single night, some after many. They walk back into the dark, and the village does not follow them. It does not call them back." "And you?" I asked. "Do you ever think about leaving?" He looked toward the darkness again, thoughtful. "I think about it the way one thinks about childhood," he said, "with curiosity, with tenderness, without the need to return." The silence that followed was not empty. It felt complete. As I stood to leave, he spoke once more. "Be careful what you listen for," he said softly. "This place does not speak loudly. It answers the questions you are afraid to ask out loud." I walked back toward the center of the village, with his words echoing quietly inside me. Somewhere behind me, the man remained seated on the steps, neither waiting nor watching, simply staying. I met her while the village was at its quietest. It was difficult to say when that happened, because night here did not deepen or fade the way it does elsewhere. There was no visible passage of hours, no slow pull toward morning. And yet, there were moments when the stillness seemed heavier, more complete, as if the village itself were holding its breath. She was standing near the road that led out, not at the very edge, but close enough that the darkness beyond felt present, waiting. She wore a coat too thin for the night, though she did not seem cold. Her hands were tucked into the pockets, her shoulders drawn inward, as if she were bracing herself for something unseen. She did not turn when I approached. "I thought you'd already gone," I said, unsure why I felt the need to speak at all. "I almost did," she replied. Her voice was quiet, steady, without hesitation. "But leaving is slower than arriving." She had been in the village for only one night, or perhaps several. Like everyone else, she could not say for certain. She remembered arriving exhausted, certain she would rest briefly and continue on. She remembered sitting in one of the houses, watching the light move across the walls without changing its position. "What made you decide to leave?" I asked. She took a long breath before answering. "I began to feel complete," she said, "and that frightened me." I waited. "Out there," she continued, gesturing vaguely toward the darkness. "I am unfinished. I am late for something. I am behind. I am becoming. That feeling pushes me forward. Here, that pressure disappeared." She turned to look at me then, her eyes reflecting the village lights. I realized that if I stayed, I might stop wanting anything at all, she said. And I wasn't ready for that. She told me about the life she was returning to, not in detail, but in fragments. Responsibilities she had postponed, words she had not said, paths she had avoided choosing, because choosing one meant closing another. "This place doesn't demand anything," she said softly, "but it also doesn't give you excuses." We stood together in silence. Somewhere behind us, a door closed gently. Somewhere else, a light dimmed, then steadied again. "Will you remember this place?" I asked. She smiled, though the expression did not reach her eyes. "Not clearly," she said. "That's part of it, I think." She stepped toward the road, then paused. "I don't think the village wants people to stay," she added. "Not really. I think it wants people to know they could." With that, she walked into the darkness. Not quickly, not reluctantly, simply forward. The road did not resist her. The night did not follow. I stood there long after she was gone, listening to the silence settle back into place. The village felt unchanged, and yet something subtle had shifted, like the echo of a thought that had almost been spoken aloud. I wondered what she would carry with her when she returned to her life, whether she would feel lighter or heavier, whether the memory of the village would surface only in moments of deep fatigue or just before sleep, when the world grows quiet enough for forgotten places to stir. As I turned back toward the lights, I realized something else. The village had not tried to stop her. It had not offered reassurance or warning. It had not closed the road behind her or opened another door in her path. It had simply let her go. And and somehow that felt like the truest thing about it. He came to the village without understanding that he was leaving anything behind. No one noticed him at first, and that was perhaps the most important thing. Children often arrive quietly, as if the world has not yet taught them how to announce themselves. He walked along the same road as the others, but without hesitation, without fear, without the careful thinking that usually accompanies such a journey. Later, when people tried to remember him, they disagreed about his age. Some said he was no older than 7. Others insisted he must have been closer to 10. The truth was likely somewhere in between. But the village has a way of softening numbers, rounding them into something less precise, more forgiving. He did not ask where he was. He did not ask who lived there. He simply wandered. He stopped to touch the walls of the houses, running his fingers along the wood as if it were familiar. He crouched near the ground to watch the way light gathered in small, unmoving pools. He listened, carefully, to sounds that were barely sounds at all. The low hum beneath the quiet, the steady presence of something patient and old. When he grew tired, he sat on the steps of an empty house and waited. Inside that waiting, memories began to surface, not sharply, not painfully, but like shapes seen through fog. A long journey in a car that smelled of dust and fabric. Adult voices tight with worry. An argument that had no clear beginning and no clear end. A moment when the car stopped, when doors opened, when someone said, "Stay here," not realizing how those words might sound to a child. He remembered getting out. He remembered the road stretching ahead. He did not remember deciding to walk. The village did not fill that gap for him. It did not explain. It did not correct the memory. It simply accepted his presence, as if this were a continuation rather than an interruption. At night, if it was night, he slept deeply, deeper than he ever had before. No dreams followed him here, or perhaps they did, but they were gentle enough to dissolve before morning could claim them. When he woke, he felt older, not taller, not stronger, but heavier in a way that had nothing to do with weight, as if some quiet understanding had settled into him while he slept. He began to notice things others overlooked, how some people stood near doors without opening them, how others avoided the road entirely, even when speaking of leaving, how the lights in certain houses seemed warmer, fuller, as though they had learned the shape of their inhabitants' thoughts. Once, he asked an old man why the clocks did not move. The man smiled and said, "They do, just not in the direction you're used to." The child accepted this answer without question. Days passed, or moments, or something in between. The boy learned the village not as a place, but as a feeling. He learned where silence grew thickest, where it loosened its grip. He learned which paths led nowhere, and which led exactly where they needed to, and slowly, without realizing it, he began to carry himself differently. His gaze steadied, his movements slowed. He stopped fidgeting, stopped searching the faces around him for reassurance. The village did not raise him, but it allowed him to grow. Then, one morning, or what felt like morning, he stood at the edge of the road. He knew, suddenly, that someone was waiting for him elsewhere. Not impatiently, not angrily, just waiting, frightened by the quiet where a voice should have been. The knowledge did not hurt. It simply existed. When he stepped onto the road, the village responded as it always did. It did nothing. No farewell, no sign, no resistance. The boy walked on, his steps steady, his shoulders squared in a way they had not been before. He did not look back. Much later, far from the village, an adult would remember a strange brief chapter of childhood, a place without clocks, a calm that felt too large to explain, a moment when fear loosened its grip and never fully returned. They would never be sure whether it truly happened. But sometimes, when life grew overwhelming, they would pause just for a breath and feel that same stillness settle around them. And for a moment, they would know exactly where it came from. There was a man who believed for many years that he had imagined the village. At first, this belief brought him comfort. It was easier to accept that memory as a dream than to question the years that followed it, years that never quite returned to the shape they once had. He had arrived there in his early 20s, exhausted by movement rather than distance. He had been traveling constantly then, convinced that if he kept going, something unresolved inside him would eventually fall away. Cities blurred together. Faces did the same. Each place felt temporary, and he had grown used to leaving before anything could ask him to stay. The village appeared at the end of a road he did not remember choosing. He stayed longer than he intended. Everyone did. When he left, he carried with him a calm that felt borrowed, not owned. It faded slowly, but not completely. Enough remained to disturb him. Years later, when his life had settled into something that resembled stability, the memory resurfaced, not as nostalgia, but as a question. So he tried to find it again. He returned to the region where he believed it had been. He walked roads that felt almost right. He asked careful questions, phrased so as not to sound foolish. People answered politely, vaguely, pointing him toward places that looked similar but felt wrong. The landscape resisted him. Paths ended where they should not have. Maps contradicted themselves. Even the weather seemed to shift at inconvenient moments, fog rising just as he thought he recognized a landmark. Still, he persisted. There was a quiet desperation in it. Not panic, but a growing sense that something important had been misplaced, and that retrieving it might restore a version of himself he could no longer access. He camped near the forest. He waited. He watched. Nothing happened. Days passed, then weeks. The silence here was different, thin, empty. It did not listen back. One evening, exhausted and frustrated, he spoke aloud, not to anyone in particular. He admitted, finally, that he did not want the village back for its peace. He wanted it because life had become loud again, and he was tired of carrying responsibility without relief. The forest did not respond. That night, he dreamed of roads looping endlessly, of doors that led only to themselves. When he woke, he understood. The village had not rejected him. It simply no longer needed him. He returned home changed in a quieter way than before. The search had stripped something from him. Not hope, but illusion. He stopped waiting for places to fix what only time and attention could soften. Yet sometimes, in moments of deep stillness, he would feel it again. That same calm, distant but intact. He realized then that the village was not a destination. It was a condition, and it appeared only when a person could not survive without it. There were people who did not leave the village when they were supposed to. No one ever decided this openly. There was no moment where someone announced that they would stay forever. It happened gradually, in the way small decisions accumulate until they resemble fate. At first, they told themselves they were resting, then that they were waiting for better weather, later that the road would still be there tomorrow. Time behaved differently for them. Days passed without sharp edges. Conversations felt complete, even when they said very little. Tasks were simple and never urgent. The village did not demand ambition, only presence. Some stayed for weeks, others for months. One woman had arrived with a suitcase she never fully unpacked. She kept it near the door, as if reminding herself that departure was still possible. Over time, dust settled on its handle. Eventually, she stopped noticing it at all. A man who once measured his life in schedules began waking without knowing what day it was. At first, this unsettled him. Then it relieved him. Finally, it stopped mattering. They noticed changes in themselves, but without alarm. Memories softened. Sharp regrets lost their urgency. The future stopped pressing against their thoughts. When asked what they planned to do next, they answered honestly, "I don't know." And it was enough. Yet something subtle shifted the longer they stayed. They began forgetting details, not important ones, but personal ones. The exact sound of a sibling's voice, the layout of an apartment they once lived in, the faces of colleagues whose names had already faded. These absences did not feel like loss. They felt like space. Some villagers noticed this and said nothing. Others gently encouraged newcomers to leave before the forgetting went too far. A few never mentioned it at all. believing that everyone arrived here with their own limit. Those who stayed longest began to blend into the rhythm of the place. They walked more slowly. They listened longer. They spoke less about themselves and more about what they noticed. The way light moved across the trees, the sound of footsteps on gravel, the calm weight of evening. Eventually, the road out became harder to describe. Not blocked, not hidden, just irrelevant. One man tried to leave after many months. He stood at the edge of the village with his bag in hand and felt something close to grief, though he could not explain why. The thought of returning to his old life felt distant, abstract, like remembering a book he once read. He turned back. Those who remained were not trapped. They had simply reached a place where nothing else asked more of them than they could give. Whether this was peace or surrender depended on who was telling the story. Not everyone noticed the village. This was the strangest part of all. Some travelers passed directly through the same forest, along the same narrowing road, under the same low sky, and yet they never saw it. Later, when asked, they would swear there had been nothing there at all. Just trees, just snow, just silence. One merchant once told a story of walking for hours through the woods, certain he had been close to shelter. He remembered feeling watched, not with fear, but with something like expectation. He followed the feeling, convinced it would lead him somewhere. It led nowhere. He slept beneath the trees that night, cold and angry, and left the forest at dawn with no memory of warmth, no image of lights, no sense that he had missed anything at all. Another traveler passed within a few steps of the village gate. He later described hearing voices carried faintly on the wind. Laughter, the clink of dishes, the sound of a fire settling. He stopped, listened, and then shook his head. Tired, he told himself. Just tired. He walked on. Those who lived in the village spoke quietly about people like this. They said the village did not appear to everyone, not because it was hiding, but because it was listening. It listened for something specific, not desperation alone. Many desperate people walked past without seeing a thing, not kindness either, or curiosity, or fear. What it listened for was absence, a space inside a person where something essential had worn thin, a place left empty not by loss alone, but by exhaustion, by carrying too much for too long without being seen. Those who still clung tightly to who they thought they were, to plans, to roles, to anger or certainty, often passed straight through. The village had nothing to offer them yet. Others were invited, but could not accept. A young man once entered the village at dusk and stayed only an hour. He sat near the fire, accepted a bowl of soup, listened to the quiet conversation around him. His hands would not stop shaking. When asked if he would stay the night, he stood abruptly. "I can't," he said. "If I stay, I won't go back. No one argued. Some people left because they feared losing their pain. Others because they feared losing their momentum. A few because they sensed, correctly, that the village would ask nothing of them, and they did not know who they were without being asked. Those who passed through without seeing it never realized they had been tested. Those who saw it and left carried the memory like a soft ache. Not regret, exactly. More like the awareness of a door they had chosen not to open. And those who stayed knew something the others did not. That being seen was not the same as being chosen. The village did not save people. It simply recognized when someone was ready to stop running, even if only for a while. Those who remained in the village eventually noticed something unsettling. Nothing was taken from them. At least, nothing they could name. Their belongings stayed where they left them. Their memories remained intact. Their bodies did not weaken, nor did time seem to move faster or slower in any obvious way. And yet something was changing. It began subtly. A man who had arrived burdened by regret realized one morning that the memory still existed, but the weight attached to it had thinned. He could recall what he had done, but no longer felt the sharpness that once followed the thought. A woman who had carried grief for so long it had shaped her posture, discovered that she could speak of the one she lost without her voice breaking. The sorrow had not vanished. It had softened, becoming something that rested beside her rather than pressing down upon her. The village did not erase pain. It rearranged it. Those who stayed long enough came to understand that the village asked for only one thing: honesty without performance. There was no reward for bravery, no praise for endurance. Tears were neither encouraged nor discouraged. Silence was allowed. So was laughter when it came naturally. The fire burned whether anyone watched it or not. The rooms offered shelter without promising permanence. And slowly, people stopped explaining themselves. Some felt as though the village had taken something from them only after they left. A man who returned to the outside world said he felt lighter, but also uncertain. "I don't know what I lost," he admitted, "only that I no longer carry it." Others realized the village had given them something difficult to name. Not answers, permission. Permission to rest without guilt, to exist without justification, to sit quietly without needing to become better, stronger, or wiser. The village did not heal in the way people hoped for. It reminded them of who they were before they learned to hide from themselves. Those who stayed too long sometimes struggled to leave. The world beyond felt louder, sharper, more demanding than they remembered. The village did not stop them, but it did not follow either. It remained where it had always been, waiting, not for everyone, only for those who would recognize it when the moment arrived and accept what it offered without asking for more. No one ever found the village by trying to return to it. Those who left sometimes turned back at the edge of the path, certain they could retrace their steps. They remembered the curve of the road, the sound of gravel underfoot, the way the trees leaned inward as if listening. But the path never appeared the same twice. Some walked for hours and found only forest. Others reached places that felt almost right. A clearing too quiet, a house that stood empty, a road that ended without explanation. Over time, stories began to circulate. Travelers spoke of people who left the village and carried something with them, a calm that could not be shaken, an ability to sit with silence without fear. These people often became listeners. They spoke less, but when they did, others paid attention. There were also stories of those who searched obsessively. They mapped forests, questioned locals, followed rumors that led nowhere. The more urgently they sought the village, the further it seemed to drift from the world they knew. One man claimed he found the place again years later, only to discover it empty. The houses stood intact. The fire pit was cold. The rooms were clean, untouched, as if waiting. But no doors opened for him. He said the village felt like a memory that refused to be relived. Others believed the village was never truly a place at all. They said it was a moment, one that appeared only when someone stood at the quiet edge of themselves. A moment when the noise of wanting fell away, and what remained was simply being. In that telling, the village did not disappear. It moved inward. It lived in the pauses between decisions, in the moments before sleep, in the rare mornings when the world felt gentle instead of urgent. Children sometimes spoke of it without knowing the name. They described houses that felt safe, rooms that listened, fires that never demanded attention. Adults, hearing this, would grow quiet because something in the description felt familiar. The village did not follow those who left. It did not haunt them. It did not call them back. But once known, it could not be entirely forgotten, like a place you visit only once. Not because it vanishes, but because you are no longer the same person who needed to arrive. When the village finally fades from the story, it does not disappear abruptly. It withdraws slowly, like a shoreline seen from a departing boat. The details soften first. The edges of the houses, the exact sound of footsteps, the way the air felt at dusk. What remains longer is the feeling, a sense of having been somewhere that did not rush you, did not ask you to become anything other than what you already were. Those who speak of the village later rarely describe it clearly. They talk instead about what followed. They speak of returning to ordinary roads, familiar rooms, known routines, and noticing how different everything felt, how the world seemed louder, faster, more demanding than before, and yet something inside them stayed quiet. They learned to pause, to sit with unanswered questions without trying to force them into shape, to let moments pass without filling them, to accept that not every place needs to be understood in order to matter. Some say the village appears again, but only briefly, in dreams perhaps, or in the space between waking and sleep, when the mind loosens its grip on time. Others believe it shows itself in smaller ways, in the warmth of a room during a storm, in the unexpected kindness of a stranger, in the stillness that arrives late at night when the world finally rests. There is no map for finding it, no ritual, no correct path. The village does not respond to searching. It responds to readiness. And readiness is not something that can be measured. It arrives quietly, often unnoticed, when someone has walked long enough with their thoughts, when they have listened long enough to their own doubts, when they are tired not just in body, but in expectation. Perhaps you have already been there. Perhaps you will be. Or perhaps the village exists only to remind us that there are places, real or imagined, where we are allowed to stop trying. As the night deepens, the story no longer needs to continue forward. It can simply settle, like embers glowing after a fire has burned low, like a room holding warmth long after the door has closed. Wherever you are listening from, whatever brought you to this moment, you do not need to carry the whole world with you into sleep. You can leave some of it here. Let the village keep what you no longer need tonight. Let the quiet stay with you. Let the unanswered questions rest. The lights dim. The paths fade. The story remains, not as words, but as a gentle echo. And now, there is nothing left to do, only to rest.